Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. It's nice and sunny in Kiev, and I hope that it's the same wherever you are. I'm very pleased to have such distinguished experts today to speak about corporate governance, and especially the topic governance in the time of crisis. We're doing this type of webinar first time in this by this means. We at UCGA have a format, UCGA Dialogues, where we discuss about various corporate governance topics. We invite corporate governance experts, our students, alumni, and discuss these issues. This time we're doing this via digital, and it seems to me that this is the way forward, at least in the immediate future, so we have to use to it. The topic of today, as discussed, it's governance in the time of crisis. And we have very distinguished people, as talked before. First of all, it's Ludo van der Heyden, and Ludo is already known in Ukraine. He is a professor at INSEAD and also professor at UCGA. He also is a supervisory board member at Naftogaz, one of the biggest and the most important companies here. We have Peter Nathanial. I hope that I'm pronouncing your surname right. Peter is contributor to the paper that was prepared together with INSEAD and UCGA, the paper on governance in crisis. We asked 7 questions to 4 INSEAD professors, and Peter is one of the contributors to that paper. We also have Aivaras Abramovichus, the chairman of UCGA Academy. Aivaras is perhaps the biggest contributor to corporate governance in Ukraine. First, while working in his capital as partner and promoting corporate governance there. Then he became chairman of UCGA. He also, I forgot the most important role, was Minister of Economy, and he started reform of state-owned enterprises. And we have Elena Voloshyna, deputy head of International Financial Corporation. She is the most experienced expert in governance, working with Ukrainian clients since early 2000s, and she has a lot of practical experience in Ukrainian context, as well as international context, because she's part of IFC. We have 2 types of questions. One type of question is from the paper that was again prepared by UCGA and INSEAD. The paper is on crisis, on the governance in the time of crisis. It's available on the UCGA website. And then we also received a lot of different questions from our students. I tried to group those questions because many of them are repeating questions. I tried to group them, and if I'm not asking the question precisely, then at least it will be more or less the same idea what the student want to ask, because again, I have to generalize those questions and fit them into groups. I will start from Ludo. And Ludo, please tell us what is the primary role of board of directors during the crisis?
Thank you, Adomas, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. Even though I'm from Switzerland and it's not good weather today, it's very foggy. But the primary role, I think, of the board is, I would say, it's an essential role, because the board is actually holds the responsibility for the organization. So at all times, the board is responsible for the company, not necessarily the CEO, not necessarily the shareholders, or not primarily the CEO and the shareholders, because shareholders come and go, as we know. They sell, they buy, and also they can't be held legally accountable. So the board is legally accountable. And so the first role and the first word is, you could call this responsibility. And that, of course, is never bigger than in a crisis, because the first responsibility of the board is to make sure that the company goes through the crisis and doesn't get hurt too badly so that it falls apart or doesn't survive the crisis. So in that sense, it could be performance, but the first element from performance is survival. And then I would say that the immediate corollary is that boards are tested in crisis. So the quality of the board will be very much revealed in crisis, much more so than in normal times, because if everything goes well in a certain way, the board doesn't do very much. The difficulty is, yes, you actually reveal the strength of the board in crisis. Now, what is the tension, or what is the paradox, or the difficulty? In crisis, you cannot improvise, so you have to be ready. So a board that is not ready for the crisis because they're clueless, because they've not actually thought about it, because they're not working very well together, that board will not help the company. And in crisis, it risks actually making the crisis worse, at which point the shareholders will take over or the managers take over. But that would basically means that the board has capitulated. So the first role of the board is to actually be ready for the crisis and to prepare for the crisis. And that requires attention before. And so this is, I think, what the board issue is. It's a paradoxical issue. A board should be very active preparing for the crisis, but the execution of the crisis is, of course, due to the executives. But boards are vital elements for the organization, but they're also vital elements for boards. That would be my major comment, Adomas, or a major reply.
Thank you, Ludo. So what you're saying that the board is the key responsibility is survival of the company, and success of the company is always the responsibility and the primary role of the supervisory board. But what changes? Environment changes and challenges changes, and then you perhaps need a bit different ways of working. And most likely, chairman of the board is the most responsible in this situation because he has to manage the supervisory board. I wonder what type of chairman do you have to have during the time of crisis, and what happens if you have the wrong chairman during the time of crisis?
Yes, the chairman is certainly the person who is most relevant for the performance of the board. And most people agree that if the board doesn't work well, if the chairman is not good, then the board cannot work very well. I think which chairman do you need? Well, most people agree that dictatorship in crisis is very dangerous. The chair who thinks he knows it all is going to have a single answer. I mean, in a certain way, we see this in the US with the president of the US. He thinks he has all the answers. And the execution in the US of the crisis response is, let's say, not optimal. And so what you need as a chairman, you need somebody who can work collectively. Ideally, you have somebody who has crisis experience, because this you cannot invent. And then you especially need somebody who knows that what he doesn't know. So you need a chairman who's relatively humble and open to ideas from shareholders, open to ideas from managers. And so somebody who doesn't have too big an ego, because that ego will destroy any kind of collective work. And the worst thing is that egos basically are people who are very strong looking, but they're actually very weak because they're not very good at listening to other people's minds. So I would say experience, engaging, empathy, humility, expertise. These are the boards that I would want to have.
Just to follow up on this, what you're saying that the person should not be a dictator for sure. Should listen to people, be humble, and not with a massive ego. But I guess during the crisis, you need to make decisions faster than in normal situation. And of course, it's good to listen to opinions and have somebody which does not have a massive ego. But how do you strike a balance between listening to everyone, having endless discussion, and making decisions on time?
Yeah, yes, first, immediately, you don't listen to everyone. I mean, because not everybody has great ideas and you don't have much time, but you listen to people who have good ideas, experts. And the first listening you have to do is to the executives. And the other listening you have to do is to the other board members, because the most important is to keep the board together. Because if you have a good board, then everybody can contribute. And I remember the chairman of the BP board. BP had a crisis in the Gulf of Mexico when the platform blew up, and the chairman said, every day I talk to every board member, because I wanted to make sure that they were all engaged and that I could have all the right ideas. That, I think, is a great sign of a chairman.
I need to unmute myself. Ludo, thank you for this answer. As discussed during the introduction, you are part of Naftogaz Supervisory Board. Also, you frequently visit Ukraine because you're a professor at UCGA, so you already know some of Ukrainian context. I was wondering, can you give a recommendation to the Ukrainian context on how Ukrainian supervisory boards might be more effective during the crisis? If they differ somehow with recommendations from international experience.
Yes, I would say the evaluation of the effectiveness of a board in a certain way comes after the crisis. So I would say during the crisis, you need to see what the board delivers. And if the board doesn't deliver value or make things worse, then you know that the board is not a good one. So in a certain way, the crisis will test the quality of the boards in Ukraine. And I think it will be easier to evaluate the quality of the boards after the crisis than now. And the other thing too is normally the way to manage a crisis is to be prepared for the crisis. So a prepared board is ready. An unprepared board is not. And if you change the board in the crisis, you actually create another crisis, because the CEO might not get along with the new chair. The new chair might say, this is not the right person. And you don't have time for that. So in that sense, you have to quickly make up your mind about how you stand with the board. If you want to make some changes, make a few changes. But don't make too many changes, because you're going to create another crisis, which is discontinuity, mistrust, etc. And basically, I would say don't tinker too much with the boards, but hold them responsible. Which is, are they helping? Are they not? Now, once you realize that the board is bad, then change immediately. But the best way to change immediately is to change the chairman, because he or she is the most important person. And it's a little bit like a coach with a soccer team. You don't know the quality of the players unless they have a good relationship with the coach. So I would say, if you want to make a change, you want to make the change at the chairman level, but not the whole board.
What you're saying that boards should create value, and you will see whether they failed or not after the crisis. I wonder how do you measure this value add, and what are the criteria to say that the board was performing good or bad, especially when evaluation comes by shareholder, not other supervisory board members that, let's say, not involved in very frequent communication with supervisory board. So it's very difficult to judge being from outside and understanding who is guilty for bad result.
I think the worst communication, of course, is silence. And I had spoken with the BP example that the chairman of BP was actually having regular discussions with every board member. Regular discussions with the shareholders, of course, very important. I'm also assuming that the chair has regular discussions with the CEO anyway, so I think that normally is not an issue. But it's regular communication with the shareholder that is very important, and I would say regular communications with all the stakeholders. And I think the first thing that boards have to do is how, between the board members and the CEO and the executives, are we going to take care of communications? So I think that's a very important point. And I think good boards communicate well and other boards communicate badly, and then they create more problems. So you immediately will see when you have good boards or not, because there's some boards that do not communicate. There's some companies that communicate, others companies that do not communicate. And all of these things finally go back to the board, which is the board knowledgeable? Does it have practice? And is it on the task when there is a crisis? So you will see it, but board work is complicated. So when you intervene as a shareholder, that's a very tricky question.
Thank you, Ludo. Peter, we already started discussing about what it takes to be a good chairman in a supervisory board during a crisis. Can you please share from your experience what are the key features or characteristics of supervisory boards during the crisis, and what features and characteristics allows supervisory boards to succeed?
Sure. Let's start with first sort of defining crisis, because it's a relative term, and people thinking that they missed their numbers, for example, or their forecasts is a crisis, on the one hand. And at the other extreme, the existential threat of the enterprise is, the full definition of crisis. So, what I would say is there are degrees of crisis, and it's a spectrum. And really, what the change that needs to take place with the chairman and frankly everybody in the organization is a change in the mindset. And if you look at, I've been in dozens, hundreds of these restructurings and liquidations and, crises of one variety or another around the world, including sovereign crises. And the biggest pattern that you observe at the very, very top is the inability to make the mind shift, to make the change of the state of mind that's required. And that has to start at the very top. And as with most things, the tone at the top really influences the rest of the organization, so either directly or indirectly. And I think once that mindset shift has been made, you, as a chairman, start to think about everything slightly differently. You have a new set of priorities, you have new goals, and you have new resource allocation, requirements. But if you still think you are trying to revert to what you were or what the organization was, you're probably not thinking about it the right way. And in that case, what you find ends up happening is the stakeholders, whoever they are, normally it's the economic stakeholders, which means normally it starts with the equity, but once the equity has really been burnt through because of the situation of the enterprise, and the creditors are now the major economic constituent or stakeholder that are at risk, then the creditors will start to force some of these behavioral changes. And if they don't see those changes coming from the chairman, the board, and the management, they'll make changes. They'll insist on changing the people. So most often, the changes occur that way. They're very, very rarely originated from, you know, the chair themselves or from the board themselves. They're most often instigated by outside stakeholders. That's just a reality of, you know, if you look at the pattern of hundreds of these situations. Of course, that doesn't work in every enterprise, and especially when you're talking about elected officials, governments, etc. They don't just disappear. They can't. There's a whole electoral process. I would say that's the sort of the very big issue. I think the other thing is you need to constantly think the decisions that need to be made in crisis, whether they are about communication, as we've been discussing, or change of people, etc., all come back to one thing, and that's really credibility. You need to maintain the confidence and trust of all stakeholders through a crisis at the leadership level. And every decision you make, it might be different in one situation versus another, whether you fire a lot of people or you change the CEO in one situation, you don't change it in the other situation, or you cut back to certain client segments in one situation, or you dispose of a division in another situation. All of those decisions relate back to the credibility and trust of the leadership, and that the stakeholder, and that the story can be told in a way that inspires confidence and trust in that leadership from everybody. Because if you lose that confidence and trust, then you've pretty much lost the reason you're there, because you're supposed to be a steady hand through the crisis. You can't get it all right all the time, but you need to get it right more than you get it wrong. And that means you don't have perfect information. And the biggest thing is, and this is part of the mindset change, is time is your enemy. And the normal reaction of people, everybody, it's a human condition, is freeze. You see a problem, you freeze. And then your second reaction is, well, I hope it gets better. And through time, it gets better. Overwhelmingly, the evidence would show over at least the last 30 or 40 years in crises that it's the exact opposite. You have much more optionality, you have more potential for resolving the situation that your enterprise is in a crisis if you act sooner, if you act earlier. Okay, the longer you leave it, I mean, there are examples, not just corporate examples, there are sovereign examples. I mean, look at the entire EU, leaving things unaddressed, leaving things too long, hoping that things will just sort themselves out, hoping that through the passage of time, everything will be, these are all human conditions, but they turn out to be the wrong response in crisis. And sometimes the counter reaction to that is from people, well, you can't act now because you don't have all the information. Well, I think, at least from my experience, acting is better than not acting in a crisis, even with imperfect information. I think that's sort of one of the sentiments to the whole management through crisis. The other element to leadership is, in a crisis, is the cohesion of the group. And of course, you can't be a dictator. On the other hand, you don't have, as I just said, all the time in the world to solicit every single person's input on every single subject. You have to start forming views quickly. And this is where the competence of individuals on the board really plays a role, because everyone can bring a different skill, perspective, or know-how to the discussion. And a good leader will look for those, but move swiftly onto the decision-making part, and not ponder and not stop on the analytical side, the analysis, because as you're analyzing or waiting for more information, time is burning, and really that is the biggest issue. So I think I would summarize as the way I started, which is the biggest shift that takes place for leadership, whether it's a board, a chairman, or whoever it is, in a crisis, is the shift in mindset. And a lot of things flow from that if you have this new mindset, which is really a bias to act as opposed to wait.
Very interesting. What you're saying, that It's human nature that people usually slow to react, and they pushed by environment to react. But if you have experience and you do the things right, it's better to start early. We have to be aware, of course, of this human tendency to react too slow and not to have this shift of mind, as you mentioned. And what I understood also that perhaps is better to overreact than to underreact, and also make decisions on imperfect information rather than wait for perfect information and never or make decisions too late. Can you?
Yeah, Adomas,
Yes.
can I add something? I'm sure it's because this is important and it adds to what Peter said. I'm sure that he meant it, but I want to underline it. It's a shift in mindset, which is we're in a crisis, and it's also having the right mindset around the right framing of the crisis. So it's not just, you know, shifting mindset, it's you may shift to the wrong mindset. You know, for example, you know, let's preserve this, or let's cut costs, you know, and then you kill the whole organization. So that's important. But I fully agree with Peter. Yeah.
Peter, you also mentioned that the company should be credible, and it should show proper leadership. I wonder from where this leadership should come, either it's management or supervisory board.
Well, the tone comes from the very top always, I think, in all organizations, whether they're elected officials or private sector enterprises. But the confidence is not just in the organization, the confidence is in the individuals. At the end of the day, people relate to individuals, and they need to see leadership at the very top that they're aware of. I mean, for example, a company or a bank that deals with consumers, a lot of consumers may not have a lot of exposure with to the chairman of the organization. They may have more exposure to the CEO. So in that case, the CEO will have to really concentrate on their credibility. But in other cases, it'll be the chairman. But it comes from the chairman. The chairman has to ensure that the individuals that are empowered to represent the firm externally, and the firm itself externally, are seen credibly, and that is through the eyes of these leaders. And the chairman and the board have to allocate time and resources to make those things a priority, because as it turns out, they may actually make the wrong decisions. Through the course of time, you'll see that some things weren't make it, but that is secondary to actually being able to keep people behind you, people supporting you, because people recognize that these are imperfect situations, very fluid, external environments. But you need to keep people moving with you. That when I say people, the stakeholders, all your stakeholders, not just your staff and your employees, but also your external stakeholders and your economic stakeholders who are expecting certain things from you. If you can explain why you're doing things, it gives them a sort of buy-in to the whole proposed actions that you're taking. And if they turn out to be wrong, that's okay. But as I said, you've got to be right more than wrong. You can't constantly get it wrong. But expecting to be correct or right 100% of the time in every decision is just not realistic. I don't think anybody expects that from anyone.
Peter, perhaps you also can comment on practical features of boards during the crisis. I mean, those features that are needed, like composition of the board, frequency of meetings, this kind of things.
Yeah, well, generally, again, as you veer into the realm of existential threat, where there's a serious risk that the enterprise won't be around in 12 months, you see behaviors change. I think the biggest behavioral change that you see in each person is the shift from what I would call greed and ambition to survival. So that shift needs to be made sooner than later, so, to survival. The closer, the further you go towards really disappearing, existential collapse. So I think you'll see different behaviors, and the chairman needs to be on the lookout for that. Just the same way the stakeholders will be watching the chairman and the board. But different directors, some disengage, some freeze and never get out of the frozen state, that what they call the deers in the headlight. Some want to get very, very involved and start running the company and act like operational management. So you get the spectrum. It's really the chairman that needs to bring those energies together, ensure that they're still fiduciaries. They are still ultimately in charge of setting the course of the ship, of the, this enterprise, if I can use that analogy, and making sure the right people are in the right positions to make the most effect. And this is often sort of mischaracterized, perhaps even misunderstood, when these large organizations, especially where you have very, very large concentrated shareholdings, where they'll go into a decline or a complete collapse, and it's very important that in one particular area of the organization you put your best people and you incentivize them to really reach their goals, because it's really for the benefit of the entire organization. And sometimes it's very hard to convince other people that I know everybody in the company is suffering, and I know that the company is at risk, existential risk, but we need to pay more than we normally pay these particular individuals in this particular area, because the amount of effort that they put in, if they in that area, can rescue the entire organization. People need to make those types of resource allocation trade-offs, and they're often hard, especially if you have state-owned entities, because the state, feels certain ways about things, and they have to manage the public perception of things as well. But it happens. It happens in banks. It happens in all types of other companies.
Thank you, Peter. Exciting answers. Aivaras, a question to you. I was wondering, what is different for boards during crisis, especially in the role of supervisory board versus management board? Who should be more important? Should supervisory board take leadership and perhaps undermine management board a bit to make decisions faster, or vice versa? Should supervisory board empower management board and give more leadership to management board and step back a bit? What's your take on this?
I think first and foremost, it should never occur, even during the crisis, that supervisory council out of a sudden takes over a managerial role. I think it could be very discouraging for the management to see the so-called senior guys, because quite often board members are more senior from experience point of view, from the reputational point of view, that out of a sudden they kind of push you aside and say, and from here on, the big boys will take over. I think that could be very discouraging. So the role of a supervisory board is the one of a mentor, if I may. These people often have been through more crisis than sometimes ambitious, young, energetic management team. So they need to be, in a way, advising them how it has been during the previous crisis, and that crisis start and crisis end. Life continues. I think there may be two spectrums of managers, so to say. Some who could be very relaxed for wrong reasons during the crisis. Others could be the ones that tend, leaning towards panicking. And I think the board should be balancing those type of managers, not to over panic and not to be overly relaxed in a way. We may be, in the middle of a crisis, all scared, and as we know, in the crisis, the eyes of the scare are very big. And the board, in a way, could also say, guys, crisis will end. Let's also look at some opportunities, among other things. But first and foremost, so board should be not panicking, should be encouraging sharing information, sharing experience, be open, communicate very well. And I think if you look back at the crisis of 2008, both in the Baltics, also here in Ukraine, it was a time when enormous amount of companies were involved in enormous amount of fraud. So board, in a way, should be very carefully assessing risk management, among other things. And especially if it is a public company or a state-owned company, board should understand that managers will have a tendency of hiding losses, of hiding the bad news, and therefore board, in a way, should strive for increasing publicity, increasing transparency, so that general public and the shareholders at large have a confidence that finances are in order. So yeah, board should continue doing its role, but again, because of its seniority, quite often I think they need to put the foot on the ground and say, don't panic. There should be opportunities ahead, or vice versa. Don't be too relaxed. I mean, these things may get worse before they get better. And I think here we should also mention that during the crisis, perhaps diversity of the board as such, becomes out of a sudden very important, because you most likely have people from all walks of life through cross-industry experience, maybe sitting on boards of other companies or still involved in executive roles, who could share that, look, we're here dealing with a railway company. And I can tell you, because I serve in the board of agricultural company, that this year, harvest will be bigger or smaller than before. So we will have more business, and the global markets for iron ore changing beyond recognition. So we should be prepared for bigger or smaller volumes during the crisis and so on. I think diversity, from experience point of view, but also gender diversity is very important. I'm a strong believer of more women on boards, and I think women are less prone to hide facts. They are less prone to get involved into corrupt and fraudulent actions. They are long-term, and I think it is very important, therefore, from early on to compose your boards that will also be very valuable composition-wise, diversity-wise during the times of crisis.
Board as a mentor, I like that. It's well-defined and easily understandable. You can have two scenarios. One scenario that you're mentoring your management, but you see that they're not performing very well, and it does not happen. I mean, they're not very good students, let's say. The other alternative that you're mentoring them well and they perform very well. When do you know that you have first option and that perhaps you need to make certain adjustments in the management if you're on the supervisory board?
Well, I think overall, crisis is a time to be united. So I may be wrong, but I would believe that during the times of crisis, you should not be very active on staff changes, especially at the very top. I think you need to encourage them, to support them, to delegate, to teach, to guide, whatever, but not be in the old Soviet style, getting a stick and kind of knocking on the head and saying that you have underperformed now, and so on. So especially this crisis, the quarantine in itself seems to have lasted not very long, and hope we don't have a second wave. So this type of few months of the turbulence, from my point of view, is certainly not a time for deep managerial changes. But obviously, once the crisis, this type of very unusual, extraordinary situation, where even Warren Buffett does not know how it's going to unfold, once it unfolds, you sit down and you look how each member of the team has behaved, whether they contributed positively, whether they acted nicely to their underlings, whether they, put together a team and said, guys, we will get through this crisis together. We will prevail. We will be better than competitors. When you see who did a good job and who did not do a good job, and assess and of course make managerial changes after that. So I'm not a big fan of making huge changes in big numbers during these type of early stages of crisis, if I may.
Well, Aivaras, you have experience and a lot of experience being on supervisory boards and also being as the key manager. And I was wondering, what is your expectation from the supervisory board when you manage? I do understand that you're saying that the board should be inclusive and guiding and mentoring, but perhaps maybe there are certain other items that you expect from the supervisory board during the crisis when you are manager.
Well, during the crisis and even before the crisis and after the crisis, especially in state-owned company, now that I run UkrOboronProm, I would really like to have a board that insulates me from political influence. This is exactly why, together with IFIs and with similar-minded people, we started SOE reform first of all back in 2015 to insulate state-owned companies from political meddling. Also I operate in the area where there is an enormous amount of stakeholders: Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Defense, National Security Council, President Office, Cabinet of Ministers, Verkhovna Rada, and so on. But no one takes leadership and ownership of the reform of the defense sector. So here, board with proper sort of authorities, and we do not have that in place yet because we are ruled by a special law, unfortunately, takes the leadership, in transformation of the company as such. So we lack a proper functioning board in UkrOboronProm at the moment, because authority of the board is limited. We have fantastic people on the board, fantastic chairman, but their powers are limited by the law. And one of the reasons for doing transformation is to bring back corporate governance, sort of the rules and regulations in UkrOboronProm in line with other state-owned companies. So we remain the only large state-owned company unreformed from that point of view, because it was excluded from the reform back in 2015 and 2016. So I miss a proper, professional, long-term, strategic board. I do not have this type of ammunition, unfortunately, at this stage.
Lena, you are experienced working in IFC, and you dealt with companies in many crises. You lived through them with your clients. And I wonder, can you share with us a case when Ukrainian companies succeeded during a crisis and what exactly they did, and maybe a case when they fail? Not necessarily we need names, but maybe you just can provide examples of what happened and what these companies, what type of decisions they make.
You actually put me on the spot. I'm trying to think of a case of how my clients managed the crisis and what was the board's role in it. Actually, there is an IFC publication that is called Managing Through the Crisis or something like that. Navigating the Crisis, which was published in 2010. And this was after the 2008-2009 crisis. It doesn't have specific cases, but it does have some recommendations. And some of those recommendations will be valid for this crisis as well. Although, in that publication, IFC is looking at, I think, like 15 or 20 different types of crises. And then there are some local crises, and then there is a global crisis. But what we're experiencing now is sort of a nuclear bomb crisis, because everything is going to be affected. And back to the role of the board in the crisis, again, IFC has put together, as a response to COVID-19 pandemic, we've put together a nice tip sheet for management and for boards. And I sent a link to our colleagues, to Stacy, and this tip sheet is actually translated in many, many different languages, including Ukrainian. So as soon as I have it in Ukrainian, I will be sharing it with the corporate governance community here. Now, what should boards be looking at, and those that succeeded in the 2010 crisis, I think were people who first and foremost, they looked at risk management. And in no particular order, in crisis, you cannot have a perfect list of things to do. But I'm just from my experience and from reading and from talking to my clients, if make sure that the risk management committee is properly operational and is looking at. If you don't have a risk management committee, now is the time to set up one immediately, almost. Second thing to look at is, of course, continuity of operations, which includes a lot of things, starting from looking at your sales and if you're cutting your expenses, look at your liquidity, look at your loans, talk to your banks, look at accounts payable, accounts receivable, and supply chains, all of the operational side of the business. Third thing, I would look at staff, HR issues, staff. I would look at management and succession planning, especially for the CEO of a company. Actually, succession planning, back to the Ukrainian context, is something that has always been taken with a lot of opposition by some owners of companies, especially family-owned businesses. It's interesting how people, because a lot of Ukrainian entrepreneurs are first generation, they refuse to start thinking about succession planning for themselves, and they don't even think about succession planning for managers. And I think during the crisis time, this is something that the board should focus on almost immediately. I would also focus on communications, internal and external. And actually, the communication needs to be very concise, very honest, because once you lose trust, whether with your own people or with the other stakeholders that you're talking to, that trust is always very difficult to gain back. And this becomes even more acute during the crisis. I agree with Aivaras that sometime, even during the crisis, one needs to look at it as an opportunity and think about a longer term strategy and see if the company will need to adapt, how the company will need to change, because we would all be different. We would all be changing. My own institution, we are going through reviewing our strategy exercise as we speak. We're looking at how we're going to do things differently 3 months from today, 6 months from today. And board's participation in this strategy formulation is also very, very important. Last but not least is the board should look at itself. How do we as a board operate? How often do we meet? What kind of documentation do we look at? Probably documentation needs to be a little simpler in the times of crisis. Do we have enough skill set, or we need to bring in some outside skills? And so who do we have on the board? And totally agree with all the previous speakers. Very important not to replace the management. The goal is mentor, as Aivaras said, steer, guide. I love the word stewardship when one talks about board's roles. So be a mentor, be a guide, be help, use your network because you have experienced people on the board, but not replace the management, that's for sure.
Thank you, Elena. Very extensive list of measures that every company needs to take during the crisis. So first of all is risk management and establish a committee if not established. Liquidity management, so focus on how can you cut costs and increase revenue. Also focus on staff to live the spirit, and succession planning, communication, evaluation of supervisory board, self-assessment, being aware. And as you say, be careful with changing the management during the crisis. I was wondering, you said that you changed things, the way you work at IFC, because you said that the world is changing right now, and you're also discussing this at IFC, and you already made some changes, or maybe you're planning some changes. So can you comment on those changes? What exactly you did or you are planning to make?
Yes, our board has approved a special COVID response facility, which is an $8 billion facility to be used globally by existing clients of IFC. And the way this facility is going to be distributed is through a streamlined procedure. It's going to take a lot less time. We're hoping that the whole processing time for us would be reduced to 4 weeks maximum. We're going through such cases with 3 Ukrainian clients, 2 in the real sector and 1 in the financial sector. So we're testing it, but at least the initial management approval was received over a 4-minute conversation, virtual conversation. So for IFC, this is something very new. So hopefully this would make us, because a lot of people criticize us for being slow and bureaucratic. So hopefully if we do this streamlined now, we will then apply it to our regular modus operandi, and hopefully we're going to be more better and a little more efficient. I'm trying to look for positives. How can we be better? And how can we use this crisis to make us a more efficient institution?
Wow, this is an excellent example of how crisis makes organizations to change. And if you will be so fast as you are right now in the future, then, this crisis is not for nothing. So good to hear. Aivaras, I wanted to ask you maybe a bit controversial question, governance related, Ukrainian context related, and especially state-owned companies related. Right now, the state of Ukraine passed a law which limits salaries for management of state-owned companies, as well as supervisory board members of state-owned companies. And it limited the pay to around $1,500 a month. It is around 10 times decrease on average compared to what was before. And I was wondering, are you taking this decision as positive? Perhaps, management and supervisory board need to show solidarity with other employees in the companies because some of the people will be laid off, or maybe this is a decision that is not optimal and it might backfire going forward.
I think it's a very relevant question in Ukrainian context at the moment. And I think we all need to debate that and make sure that state-owned enterprise reform as such is not rolled back. I believe that IMF and G7 and IFIs and business community need to stand firmly and continue to demand that this particular reform stays in place. When I took over Ministry of Economy in December 2014, that year combined losses of all state-owned companies was $10 billion. And only then we started a reform of state-owned enterprises, creating the first professional boards, requesting all companies to publish financial statements, requesting all companies to be audited. And with it, we brought a completely different quality of managers and board members. Many forget that back then it was impossible for UkrPoshta or Naftogaz or railways to raise money on competitive financial markets at extremely low and competitive rates. And only due to these sort of steps, for transparency and for transformation, we were able to do that. And we raised money for these companies for development and so on. So while a temporary measure, I can understand, for board members especially, we know that many do not need to travel to faraway places. So the commitment time-wise, at least from a travel perspective, decreases. I know that many state-owned companies, including Naftogaz, including Ukrainian Railways, have proposed themselves to decrease on a temporary basis the remuneration, which was very well received by all the industry, sort of the experts and so on. But it should not be a long-term phenomenon. I think people need to be compensated for the time commitment, for the reputational risks that a job at a state-owned company carries with itself. Media coverage, which tends to be very negative for absolutely wrong reasons. All of that needs to be compensated. We started early on in this reform with fairly high rates of remuneration to compensate for risk, because we didn't know if anyone would be willing to be associated with Ukrainian state-owned companies. By now, we created a very positive vibe, atmosphere. Many very distinguished peoples are keen to help Ukrainian state-owned companies develop. So therefore, compensation for this type of reputational risk can already be somewhat lower than just a few years ago. And myself including, and our academy, and I know Office of the President and Cabinet of Ministers have reached out to some of the global HR companies who have conducted research on remuneration levels, which indicated, some decrease from the recent levels, but not a substantial. So a 10-time decrease is something that will run the reform into the ground. So I hope it stays temporary, but as most of the reforms, they can be rather unpopular because it's an easy target by the populace. But I think it is very important for responsible politicians to stand the ground and understand that state-owned companies have notoriously and historically been endless pits of corruption, very concrete ways for personal enrichment, and only this particular reform managed to prevent these type of habits from continuously repeating themselves. Again, we're not in Switzerland yet. The system is not perfect. We just started this transition about 5 years ago. We will make mistakes, but we need to stay on course.
Thank you, Aivaras. Peter, if I may, I'll put you a bit on the spot, and the question is as follows. You have three types of institutions or organizations. You have private sector, completely market remuneration. Then you have state-owned companies, which are different compared with private sector, but also they're different from public service, from ministries, from parliamentarians, and from politicians. And usually, if you look, private sector has the best compensation. Then you have state-owned companies, they're in the middle, and politicians and state service, usually they compensated with quite little salaries. And most likely this happened because in politics it's just impossible to explain to people why high salaries must be paid. And high salary usually considered by people is higher than average, which average for leaders of any organization maybe is not the best benchmark. So when I said I'll put you on the spot, I'll put you on the spot in such a way that imagine that you are a politician and you need to set salaries to state-owned companies, to the leadership of state-owned companies. So you need to set a level and you need to explain to people why you're setting this level. What would be your answer?
Well, look, you open a whole different discussion here, which is relevant in the Ukrainian context, which is why do people become politicians? They don't become mostly not because of the salaries. Okay, some have civic duty and public policy, ambitions that they want to contribute to the good of the country, etc. But unfortunately and cynically, many don't. Many do it because they have their own interests, and it helps them pursue those interests. So, you know, if you look at the world and the spectrum of the world, the 165 countries that, you know, we do business in, and you look at where a country falls on that plot of why are politicians becoming politicians, you have to sort of establish that first. That's where you are in the spectrum, and then get reality. Because, you know, unfortunately, I think we're in Ukraine's case, we're not at the, as was just mentioned, we're not at the other end of the spectrum where there's an altruistic, you know, purpose for becoming a public policy official for the betterment of the community and all that sort of stuff. So let's assume we're dealing with people like that. Let's assume we're dealing with people who are, in good faith, trying to do the best for their country, and they seek political careers to do that. So I just wanted to define that role first. Okay, those people, I think what you could draw from some experiences in some countries, including Britain, quite frankly, is that the government actually, for civil servants in some areas, and I use the Treasury as an example, under the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, recruits only the absolute top from the best schools in the UK, the best colleges in the UK, United States, okay, by any measure, but it is in the UK. So, you know, it starts with things like that. It's what is the message? We talked about the tone at the top earlier of enterprises, but the country is an enterprise too. What is the tone at the top of the country? What are the priorities, and what are, we talk about the reform agenda. It is no coincidence that the spreads of Ukrainian debt are where they are. That's not a coincidence. That's not a market anomaly. That's in relatively efficient markets, even with lower overnight rates, the sovereign spread, certain concern with transparency, and governance at the very top of the country. Unfortunately, everybody underneath that, but every country has its so-called risk-free rate, and it's its own sovereign. And most people have to operate in market terms underneath those parameters. And the risk, this conduct, this absence of transparency and pushing the reform agenda through has impacted credibility and trust. And the way the average guy pays for it is through the cost of funds. And at the end of the day, unless the tone at the top is actually reflected through actions that the world can say, okay, now we get it, these guys are serious, then people in the country will start to follow the same sort of behavior, whether it's state-owned enterprises or private sector, because they will know what's expected or what's accepted and what's not accepted. And the market reflects that ultimately in a greater availability of capital markets, instruments, better pricing, etc. Right now, I would say that it's a relatively closed market and quite opaque from the outside. And a lot of it doesn't stem from the traditional, developing market fiscal account issues, which in a lot of the countries. It comes from this governance issue. It's really square in the pocket of the anti-corruption bills and the reform agenda and all that sort of stuff, which in other countries isn't that compartmentalized, quite frankly. So it's actually, makes it a lot easier in a way to do something about. But the point is, what is the tone at the top? Before you set political agendas for compensation, the compensation discussion, quite frankly, has very much to do with the credibility of the government. Why are they putting certain people in certain positions? Are there conflicts of interest? Are there affiliates, related parties, etc.? Are the other operations of government, including Justice Department, money laundering, etc., are doing their jobs? I mean, of the institutions in the place to then come up with an action plan on who do you want in which positions, and then how do we compensate them, because you're going to get what you measure. And if you put a certain type of person in with a certain type of compensation, then you can expect a certain result. But that is absolutely square in the pocket of the existing government. And as I said, I think that all trickles down eventually.
Thank you, Elena. You constantly work with Ukrainian clients, and you try to sell them corporate governance. By sell, I mean that you try to convince them that they need to proceed and establish supervisory boards. And definitely supervisory boards cost some money and they create some value. So since you're convincing them to create such boards, you think that the value add is higher than the cost. And there are a number of such companies that you help to create boards, and one of them is MHP, perhaps the best Ukrainian company. And Yuri Kasyuk, the shareholder of the company, he told to UCGA students that he was convinced personally by you, and he was very skeptical at the very beginning, but then he understood the value of it, and of course he keeps the board till this day. So I wonder, what are the arguments for you when you talk with clients to establish supervisory boards?
Yes, MHP is actually a good case. And the owner was indeed quite skeptical, but now he is one of the biggest supporters of corporate governance in the country because he honestly, truly believes that the board brings a value. And the way he describes what his board does for him is, in addition to providing the international experience in the financial sector, he has someone with a banking background. He has someone with experience in poultry sector, an ex-IFC engineer that is now working for his board as well. He's thinking of being very creative and bringing someone who's completely not even in business. At some point, he was considering bringing a philosopher or a scientist to his board, so he brings the necessary expertise that he himself lacks. And the other thing he says his board does for him is every big decision that he makes for his company, he runs through the board, and the board is like a sounding board for him. So if the board says no, they discuss it. Even as authoritarian as Yuri is, because he's a very independent person. And very often, especially before he had a proper board in place, he was thinking as an entrepreneur. But now, every next step in developing his business, he brings to the board, discuss it, so if the board approves, he goes ahead. If not, then he doesn't do it. So he honestly sees a lot of value in the board, but he keeps changing the composition as the company grows. So it's very living organism. It's not something that is fixed.
Thank you, Lena. So we discussed about the role of the board during crisis. So we discussed about what are the key tasks, what are the futures of successful board. We discussed about the relationship between management and the supervisory boards. This is one item of questions. The other is to understand the environment of crisis. And right now we're in a unique crisis in terms of unknown, because we have very limited information and we don't know what will be the world post corona. So I just wonder, since all of you participate in supervisory boards and you have your own scenarios, you have some information, but it's not perfect. I don't understand that. I wonder what's your view on how the world will look like after Corona. And to be specific, it's a general question how the world will look like, and a specific question, when we will get back to normal, and will we get back to normal? So Ludo, maybe we can start from you.
Yes, thank you for a very difficult question. I would say that we have never seen as much uncertainty about, in a certain way, so little and so much. So, you know, all the people are there, all the factories exist, you know, all the cars are parked, all the offices are there. So all the physical stuff is there. So that we know, but nothing works. So this is completely new. I would say that my expectation is that we're going to learn to live with the COVID, and that it's going to be a U-shaped recovery, that we're going to be a little bit more restricted physically, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be restricted, from interacting like we're doing it now. There is an element of interaction which will last, which is international exchange, cooperation by email, much more digital, which is helping a lot. Except for that, I think sort of slow recovery, and we must, because the biggest crisis is actually the economic crisis. And we will remember that, you know, we can't pay doctors and hospitals if the economy doesn't work. So we need to restart, but this is a very insidious virus, but it's not a very dangerous virus, in the sense that not many people die. This is not like MERS. You know, in MERS, 35% of the people who contracted the virus died. Here, it's more like maybe 2%, maybe 1%, maybe even less. So, and this is among the people who contracted it. So, I think I would say there's been a lot of emotional reactions to this because we didn't know it. People like me should be very careful, and young people like you, Adomas, should just get back to work and be not stupid, be very careful, because what we've learned from COVID is that the people who are undisciplined and who do foolish things are being hit. So I'm actually much less worried about the health crisis than I am about the economic crisis. I would say there is one element of risk I have, which is if we go back to the Spanish flu in 1918, the second wave was much more deadly than the first wave. So, you know, the second wave came a couple of months after. So we should be ready for a second wave. And in that sense, we shouldn't let the guard come down. We should be very disciplined and not sort of imagine that because of deconfinement, things are over. But the real issue now is managing both the sanitary crisis, which in a certain way we know, social distancing, washing your hands, you know, don't cough into people's mouth and things like that in people's face. I think what seems to be more difficult is the economic crisis, and this is due to the interdependence. So we need to relaunch the economy, but of course we need to relaunch it in a safe way. And I think this is the key lesson of the crisis. If you exit of the crisis badly, then you create an even bigger crisis. That's the problem that is now sort of unfolding in front of us in the US. That if the corona dies out, then you don't have a problem. So we in the risk-wise, you only need to worry about the fact that it might flame up again. So that's the risk you have to manage. But we sort of, by now, we know how to manage that. Not perfectly, but we know how to manage it. And hopefully, you know, we'll be like the flu. So most people expect that in the spring next year, there will be a vaccine. That's not 100% sure, but that's sort of a reasonable guess. And for sure, there will be antiviral treatments. So I would say we need to last through December. That's sort of my answer.
Thank you for a precise month. Aivaras, what you think? What I hear from Ludo, that he doesn't think that we overreact and we have to be extremely cautious, and probably healthcare crisis is more important than looming, waiting in the future economic crisis. I wonder what's your take, Aivaras, on this, and also how do you see Ukrainian businesses changing, especially agriculture, if we're planning any change, and also military, the sector where you are right now?
I think the biggest theme that I would point out is that weaker economies will suffer much more than developed economies. And I think this crisis, unfortunately, will hit emerging markets and developing world much more severely than developed world. And here, my only hope is that more developed countries will acknowledge this fact and will be in solidarity with their weaker neighbors and reach a helping hand and basically get through this crisis together. I think Ukraine is one of those weaker economies. I think Ukraine's economy was not prepared for this crisis, even though it seems to be dealing with it in a much better and orderly way than 2014 or 2008 and 9 crisis. We have a bit of a defensive export composition with a lot of soft commodities that world still consumes, although at 5-year low prices, and a few other things. We had very big negative travel deficit, and people obviously do not travel, therefore money is not leaving the country. So some of those things work to the benefit of Ukraine. But I also believe that it is always very difficult to expect from politicians to do reforms during the good times. And it is always the bad times that force them for some very dramatic and radical reforms and changes and so on. I mean, think 2014, 2015, and so on for Ukraine. And I just hope that weaker economies, younger democracies, Ukraine including, will use crisis to pass some very important legislation so that structural changes are cemented, for the longer term benefit. When it comes to business in Ukraine, I think the biggest immediate risk is that we switch away from automatic refund of value-added tax for the exporting companies. I think this was one of the biggest achievements in the past 5 years by Prime Minister Groisman and Minister of Finance Daniluk. And there are some sort of rumors, suspicions, worries that we may move back again to a manual handling and a corrupt handling of VAT reimbursement. So I think that we need to make sure that this does not happen, because it would be a major rollback. But overall, for the politicians of the country, I would just say that stay on IMF program course, and you will get through the crisis in a much easier way than you would if you did not work together hand in hand with IMF and other IFIs.
Peter, what's your take when we're out of this crisis? And will we be out, or the world will be changed constantly in some way? And also, you're in education sector. I wonder how education sector will change in the nearest future. Actually, it's already changing. So I wonder this year how education will look like, executive education in INSEAD, for example.
Okay, I'll leave the INSEAD question more to Ludo, so I'm answering that one first. You've already seen change in the United States here where I live. The University of Pennsylvania and others have moved their programs, their master's programs, their degree programs to full online offerings. So I think the world has recognized pretty quick. The US may have large shocks when they occur, but they also tend to react rather quickly to things. So you see the adaptation of business models starting to set in, whether it's restaurants, food deliveries, car services, or in this area, education. And clearly for the last 60 days, everyone has, in the education space, has been talking about a real change in the business model going forward for these schools. And their challenge is to differentiate the online offerings from the in-person offerings, where they can charge a premium, and where they've traditionally been. So they're all scrambling through all those things. They have to sell, I think, the merits of in-person training and chemistry and networking and all that sort of stuff, instead of just the information exchange. Because if it's just an information exchange, you can email the course to somebody, online. So that's a pricing issue. It's a market issue, and I'm not sure it's resolved, but they're all the institutions are making the changes they need to, and it will deeply affect their own institutions in terms of the infrastructure, where all the endowments, are. The model has been keep investing in the infrastructure, including the faculty at some of these great schools, so that you can keep attracting new people at current market rates, which are going up on average 30% per annum. I think that model is over. That's dead. So that's education. The rest of the world, I think it's very hard to tell. I think one of the risks is, however, not to try to think of going back to what it was. I mean, I think that's just a dead end approach. I don't know what the future looks like, but I know that if we are set on restoring it to what it was, it's probably not out for us, and we'll be deeply disappointed. So, does demand come back? Eventually, it does. Not soon, but eventually. Does it come back in the same form? Is output in the same form? No, I don't think so. I think business models change. I think people say, I used to travel 5 times a month. Maybe I only need to do that once a month now. I've proven that through this model. And I think it creates further separations in society between white collar and blue collar, because a lot of the blue collar workers still need to get out of the house and do whatever they do in service related functions. And white collar people are less required to do that. They can do things remotely. So the distribution of wealth thing, I think, is further exacerbated for the negative, even after the global financial crisis, which already created a massive chasm in distribution of wealth and income. And this issue, which I feel I agree very much with, that there are certain economies that don't have the resilience. I mean, there's a whole preparedness issue. The whole world was not prepared, quite frankly, for this. That's a mistake of public policy for the last 20 years. But let's move on from that. Now, resilience to the shocks. Clearly, the wealthy nations will have more resilience. Yes, people will die and all that stuff, and we'll get through it eventually. And we need to, get out of the deers in the headlight phase, which is everybody stop everything. That's deers in the headlight, classic. That's everybody stop everything. Instead of let's find a way to work through this and not stop everything. Humans are amazingly, the ingenuity of humans and their ability to adapt to all sorts of adverse situations, including bombings and occupation and all types of terrible things, is amazing once you make that mind shift, and when people understand that things are different and we're going to do things differently. But I'll finish with the point that the countries without the resilience will really suffer this time for lots of reasons to do with demand, commodity pricing, etc., that were already mentioned. And I think in combination with isolationism, which the world has seen in certainly the last 5 to 10 years, which will continue no matter what happens, even including the next US presidential election. I think isolationism continues. That recipe is a real problematic formula for the future. Isolationism with a lot of countries that will experience fiscal, financial issues, and then you get to the traditional scramble for resources and who's a resource, exporter and all that sort of stuff, and things get very territorial. So that's a little dystopian, but I think they're the things we need to look out for going forward, because that's when we plan. We'd love everything to be great and to fall into place, but we have to think about what could go wrong. So that's my view.
a bit bleak future, but as you say, it's better to shift our minds right now based on this information and not expect a bright future and, you know, stay hands put on the table and not doing nothing. It's better to be prepared for the future, even if it's not as positive as we expected or we would love to have. Yeah, you are with AFC, and AFC has massive analytical resources, and I'm sure that you're planning various scenarios on when we out and how we out of this crisis. So I wonder what is the base case scenario for IFC, and also a question. We discussed that the future is a bit bleak right now, but every crisis also creates opportunities. And I wonder, do you see any opportunities for Ukrainian businesses during this crisis or after the crisis?
IFC is in the process of putting together the plan of how we're going to go back to work. We actually quarantined earlier than Ukraine. This was a decision by senior management of IFC that was taken sort of globally. And I think we will be coming back to the office later and in a different form and fashion. What's going to change is the world is going to be, it's probably never going to be the same again, that's for sure. It's not going to be normal, as you said. You asked, when are we going to be back to normal? The normal is going to be new. The world is certainly going to be more digital. So some sectors of the economy would need to adapt to that. I think there's going to be some big changes to the way banks operate. They would need, I think, fintech may take over some of the banking functions. Some sectors are going to be hit big time, like airlines, tourism, entertainment. Retail would need to adapt as well. They will have to balance between offline and online. Supply chains will change, very likely. And this is an opportunity for Ukraine because Ukraine can participate in international supply chains. So this is our opportunity that needs to be looked at, and we shouldn't miss it. I also think, and this is my personal view, that healthcare is going to change significantly, and that's another opportunity. Because the way Ukrainian healthcare has not been reformed, because the reform have just started recently, and it is now being sort of sidetracked because of the coronavirus. I think that the people in Ukraine, and even the oligarchs who were forced to stay in Ukraine and couldn't leave to Vienna and Germany for treatment, or Switzerland, now will be a need to fundamentally reform the sector. So that's another opportunity for the private sector, because without the private sector, the healthcare system in Ukraine is not going to be efficient. Last but not least, this is not the IFC view, I think my own view, I think the working pattern is going to change. It may be that we will not be working in the office 5 days. It may be that we will be in the office 4 days and 1 day working remotely. Because one thing that was tested during this quarantine is, in fact, we can operate remotely. Not everything needs to be done in the office. We don't have to be in the office 8 hours every day. So maybe there's going to be some flexibility, which I think is going to be positive. And last but not least, and this is what you get when you have a woman on the panel, dress code is going to change. I don't know how I'm going to wear heels. I'll be honest with you. After all these nice sneakers, it's been so comfortable. And maybe for you guys, finally, you know, the ties are going to get away. You don't need ties. Ties is just, it's not something you really need. So just a little bit of humor towards the end of the discussion.
Definitely, there are some positive things with this quarantine measures, and myself have become not less productive in terms of work, but I sleep better, I eat better, and I do more of sports. So I save a lot of time, and I'm sure that it's the same for most of the people. as people say that let's hope for the best, but prepare for worse. But I hope for the best that Ukrainian economy will lift as the plane behind Aivaras' back, the legendary Mria plane, and everything will be fantastic. And I wish all of you to stay fit and to stay healthy. Thank you very much for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.